everyone, welcome back to the channel. As you know, I'm currently doing a video series about Lord Dunmore's War, which is the last Indian War of the colonial period, and that is based on my master's thesis research. In the last video, I talked a little bit about the preparations being made by Andrew Lewis's Southern Division. I talked about the accusations that Governor Dunmore was making against the Shawnee, and I talked about the Sinking Creek Massacre, because even though this is something that Logan's doing and it's kind of off in the periphery, it's still important because at this point the Virginians, they don't know who's to blame. They don't know if this is evidence that Dunmore and Connolly's claims of Shawnee aggression are true, or if this is something else altogether. If you haven't seen the previous videos I've done on this topic, I did put together a playlist so it could be easier for you to watch them in order, and I will put a link to that playlist up here in the corner so that you can find that easily. Today we're going to get into the topic of the Battle of Point Pleasant, which I know is probably what most people are interested in and are here to find out about. It's certainly the most well-known element of this Indian War. And just kind of as a reminder before I get into this, I am not a military historian. When I talk about battles, I'm not really focused on troop movements. What I'm interested in is, why are we here? Who is involved? What's everyone's motivations? I'm a little less concerned about, exactly what order they all marched in and how exactly, my eyes kind of gloss over at that point. And honestly, I think the value in the Battle of Point Pleasant, to my mind, is not that everyone is so familiar with it, but because the outcome of this battle is probably one of the most significant in terms of the impact it had on the loyalties of the men involved. And I'm not just talking about the Virginians at this point, I'm talking about the American Indians as well. Because this really had an impact on what their choices were going to be over the next few years. Keep in mind, Dunmore's War is taking place in 1774, so there's a lot going on in the colonies that has nothing to do with an Indian War. So in September of 1774, the Southern Division assembled at Camp Union, which is now Lewisburg, West Virginia. And the plan is to travel up the Kanawha River to meet up with Dunmore at what we now call Point Pleasant, West Virginia. And it's just across the Ohio River from the modern state of Ohio. It's at the intersection, or I guess you'd say junction, of the Kanawha River and the Ohio River. So there are a lot of different numbers out there as far as the total strength of the armies that are going to be engaged in this battle. And this is a problem we have throughout Dunmore's War and everything kind of connected to it. I've seen a really frequent estimate is that Colonel Andrew Lewis's Southern Division had 1,400 men. And I don't think they even had that many. I think it's closer to 1,300, and that is based on some of the records that were maintained by Colonel Fleming, and that he kept along the journey. So the Southern Division, they are comprised of men from Augusta, Botetourt, and Fincastle counties primarily, but they're also joined by some men from Culpeper and Bedford counties, from Dunmore County, which we now call Shenandoah, as well as Captain Harrod's Kentucky Volunteers. And Colonel Preston had even discussed additional men from North Carolina because they were concerned they weren't going to be able to recruit a large enough force. And, and we're just talking about the Southern Division when I rattle off these places. Keep in mind that Dunmore's Northern Division ends up getting joined by men from Pennsylvania and Maryland. So when you really think about it, there's at least 4 colonies involved in this Indian War, not to mention all the different American Indian tribes that were involved to some capacity. So the scope of this is a little bit bigger than what it might seem like at the beginning. So, we have all that I kind of want to take care of before we get into the discussion of the battle. And I also want you to think about this, there were a lot of the men involved in this that were really close to one another. The expedition, they were friends, they were family. We've already established that the Southern Division is commanded by Colonel Andrew Lewis, but 3 of Andrew's sons fought at Point Pleasant. Two of his brothers, Charles and John, also fought. Charles Lewis was the youngest of the four Lewis brothers, and he was really well known for his skill as a fighter. During the French and Indian War and Pontiac's War, it was fairly common that frontiersmen would get together and pursue American Indian raiding parties to try to get back any white colonists who'd been taken captive. But you know what was uncommon? For any of these groups of colonists to actually successfully get anyone back. I mean, they were really risking their neck and usually didn't get anything out of it. Charles was known for being someone who had actually managed to, as Stuart put it, Charles pursued, overtook, and defeated an American Indian raiding party, which was a big deal. And he also had this really likable personality, unlike his older brother Andrew, who was kind of the stern and solemn type. So everyone just loved Charles. And another officer that we have present is Colonel William Fleming. He was a doctor. He had graduated from the University of Edinburgh. He had spent time as a surgeon in the British Navy, so he has a lot of experience as well. And I talk about these men for a couple reasons. I want you to know them as people, and you'll see why. But Charles Lewis and William Fleming, they're both in their 40s at this point, and they are highly experienced officers, rivaling Andrew Lewis in terms of experience. So, you know, if we want to look at anyone in the Southern expedition and be like, oh yeah, these are men who knew what they were doing, then Charles Lewis and William Fleming are really some names that we need to discuss. And I think we also need to acknowledge that there were some differences between the Southern Division's expedition to Point Pleasant and MacDonald's expedition against Lakomäki and the upper Shawnee towns. MacDonald's men set off with the clear intention of destroying towns and taking prisoners. That was really their main objective. MacDonald did demand the release of a couple prisoners, you know, as part of the events that unfolded, but that was an afterthought in a way. You know, that wasn't the primary reason that they had gotten all these men together and marched. The Southern Division, on the other hand, they didn't fully know what they were getting involved in. The only concrete goal was to go to Point Pleasant and build a fort. And at this point, there's multiple treaties that allowed the building of forts, as well as the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So we've already touched on those treaties in previous videos, but I just kind of want to point this out because there is that opening where, you know, there's a clear cut, at least in the eyes of the British government, there's this clear right that the Virginians had to build a fort. And also, Kayashuda, and I might be mispronouncing his name a little bit, but he is a chief of the Ohio Haudenosaunee, and he'd even been recommending that the Virginians build a fort here. So it's not this wild, crazy idea. It's a pretty seemingly logical step, especially if they're being told all these claims from Connolly at Fort Pitt about supposed aggression. Well, this is a defensive move that they can make. But, you know, at the same time, it's probably not going to be helping matters with the Shawnee. Assuming that the Shawnee are out to start a war and they're angry and they're upset. Well, if you look at the reason that they were upset, that their hunting ground was taken, and then you build a fort right there in the middle of it, that's probably not going to soothe any tempers or anything, right? That's not going to give them a hope of a resolution that they're actually going to be happy with. So it's one thing to say that the Virginians had an established right to do something, and it's another to say that it's not going to upset anyone. As far as I can tell, the idea of continuing across the Ohio River and attacking the Shawnee directly, at this point, it's speculation. The men know that at some point this might happen, but they're really just waiting for Dunmore to kind of give them a final decision on if that's going to be part of this expedition or not. It's not clear-cut yet. On August 30th of 1774, before they even met at Camp Union, Andrew Lewis had received a message from Dunmore, and Dunmore had asked that the Southern Division change their route, and now he wants them to meet at the mouth of the Little Kanawha River. This is what's now Parkersburg, West Virginia. And there just isn't a good direct route there from, Botetourt County and kind of the heart of where the Southern Division was going to be meeting up. So we don't know what exactly Lewis said in response. We only kind of know how he was talking about this later with Colonel Preston. But essentially Lewis is like, we're not in a position to change destinations. Like, that's not going to work. At this point, there were very few Virginians who had explored that part of America, up the Kanawha River to where it meets the Ohio. Very few men have been there. And even though they have one man with them who has gone up the Kanawha River, that's all he's seen. He doesn't know all of these different, hunting paths and everything that the American Indians have through West Virginia. They're not familiar with it. So the surest method of travel is going to be going up the New River to the Kanawha River to where it meets with the Ohio, because that is going to give you very, very obvious landmarks. You can't possibly get lost. But also it's going to give you a constant supply of fresh water available. This is really important because not only are you marching over 1,000 men, about 1,300 is my estimate, but they're also taking pack horses with supplies. They are taking cattle to have fresh meat on the journey. There's a lot of logistics to consider. You can't just be taking off over mountains when nobody knows the terrain. So that's one thing. Also, for their entire journey to Point Pleasant, they're being watched by small groups of American Indians that are kind of keeping an eye on their progress. So there's at least one of the Virginians who gets killed by one of these smaller groups, and another gets wounded. So you have that going on, and that's despite the fact that they're kind of taking the safer, surer route to get there. And they try to maintain their guard. Now, Andrew Lewis and most of his men reached Point Pleasant on October 6th, and they start fortifying the area. Colonel Christian and his Fincastle County men, they're, several days behind. If I remember correctly, I think they had some of the food supplies and stuff with them, but they're traveling slower. And again, I'm going to go back to the topic of numbers, because again, I see these higher numbers quoted for the Virginian side during the Battle of Point Pleasant, but not only am I really leaning towards the Southern Division starting out with a smaller number of men, but as I say, Colonel Christian and his men, they're not even there. They're back further behind. That's 300 men right there. So if we started out with 1,300, now we're down to about 1,000. And I'm going off the documentary record here, the records that were kept by the officers on this trip. So I think that's probably the most accurate number we're going to get. And if, someone out there is disagreeing with me, which I'm sure they will, because I know I'm disagreeing with some established historians, I don't know what to tell you. This is what the evidence shows. So they get to Point Pleasant, and at this point, Lewis and Dunmore, they're sending messages back and forth because Dunmore's up at Fort Gower, a little ways up the Ohio River. But overall, they had expected Dunmore to meet them at Point Pleasant, and he's not there. So this is reinforcements they were expecting that just never materializes. Instead, Dunmore ends up leaving Fort Gower and marching directly on the lower Shawnee towns. But of course, he hasn't done this yet. The Southern Division have no idea that's what he's going to end up doing. And they're just kind of sitting there. If you've been in the U.S. Army now, you may be familiar with the term hurry up and wait. And that's kind of the position that Andrew Lewis and his men were in at this point. And there's a number of things that would later strike the Virginians as odd about how everything went down. And it would lead to various rumors about Dunmore. On October 9th, I said there's messages going back and forth, right? So on October 9th, messengers arrived from Dunmore again. And one of them is an Indian trader by the name of William McCulloch. I might have Scottish ancestry, but I don't know how to pronounce all these names. But he knew Captain Stewart from where they'd previously met in Philadelphia, and he decides, I bet he's with these men. I'm gonna seek him out. We're gonna catch up. So he stops by and he says hi to Stewart, and McCulloch's talking about how he left the Shawnee towns, made his way to the governor's camp, And that's kind of how he ended up being recruited to be a messenger. Okay. So Stuart asks, well, you're familiar with the Shawnee. Do you think there's going to be a battle? And McCulloch replies, quote, aye, they will give you grinders, and that before long, end quote. To this day, we cannot be sure how much McCulloch knew and chose not to say. But at the same time that he was having this conversation with Stuart, across the Ohio River, the Shawnee leader Cornstalk was leading a group of American Indian warriors. And I shouldn't say group, I should say an army, because there were hundreds of them. And they were planning to attack the Virginians before they could meet up with Dunmore and have a more sizable force. Which, it's good strategy, right? To keep your enemy split up and attack them while they're weaker. Cornstalk, he had a number of Shawnee. I mean, he was a Shawnee headman himself. But he also has Lenape, Ohio Haudenosaunee, Ottawa, and others. Remember, in American Indian culture, individual warriors could do as they wished. They didn't have to wait for permission. They could go off and fight wherever they felt compelled to go fight. So there may have been additional nations that were represented. I know I have seen one or two others mentioned in the historical record, but it just kind of, I wasn't certain if anyone was sure that they were present or if it was just they're throwing out the names of nations that they know. But I find Cornstalk fascinating because he's worked so hard up to this point to maintain the peace. All summer, he'd worked to keep the Indian traders safe, to do everything he could. But when his men are determined to fight, then he gets on board. So that night, October 9th, he offers to go across the river and just, have a little chat with the Virginians, discuss peace. We know that Dunmore was making accusations against the Shawnee, but this is a different group of Virginians. Maybe they'll be a little bit more open to it than Dunmore was. You never know. His men refused. And Cornstalk, he stands by the wishes of his men. He's like, all right, this is the course you want to take. This is what we're going to do. So at some point in the night, we don't know when, but at some point, the whole group crosses the Ohio River. Captain White Eyes of the Lenape, he's not fighting, but he's with Dunmore, and he warned Dunmore that, quote, 700 warriors were gone to the south to speak with the army there, and that they had been followed by another nation, that they would begin with them in the morning, and their business would be over by breakfast time, and then they would speak to his lordship, end quote. We don't know if Dunmore made any attempt to warn the Southern Division, or if there was even time. There certainly isn't any evidence that they received a warning. So before dawn the next morning, now we're up to October 10th, there were 2 small hunting parties of Virginians that left the Southern Division's camp. Despite taking provisions, including cattle, the men really wanted to supplement their diet with something else. One of the parties, which is 2 men, Joseph Huey and James Mooney, they went northeast of camp along the path of the Ohio River about 2 to 3 miles. And that's where they come across Cornstalk's army making final preparations to attack. Cornstalk's army spots them and fires on them. Huey is killed, but Mooney makes it back to the camp in order to sound the alarm. And remember, this is before dawn, so most of the Southern Division are sound asleep. Now, Mooney is claiming that there's over 5 acres of land covered in American Indians, as thick as they could stand beside each other. I don't know what number that is supposed to equate to, but whatever. Clearly, the Virginian officers didn't know what to make of the claim either. They, like I said, they'd been seeing small parties that had been kind of following them along their journey. So at this point, Lewis and his officers, they're like, well, maybe Mooney just kind of came across one of those parties and he got freaked out and, maybe it's not really a thing. So at this point, Lewis gets together 2 groups of men to go investigate the threat. So remember Charles Lewis and William Fleming, who I mentioned before, his 2 most experienced officers. Andrew Lewis sends out 2 detachments. He sends out 150 Augusta County men under Colonel Charles Lewis, and he sends out 150 Botetourt men under Colonel William Fleming. And they march like in 2 separate lines, and they meet the American Indian force a little ways away from camp. Meanwhile, Andrew Lewis, he's back at camp trying to get everyone awake and organized, which I don't think is particularly strange for a military leader, who's in command of the entire army. But he does later get criticized for being at the camp, organizing, reinforcements and supplies and all that stuff. He gets criticized for not being in the heat of the battle. Not sure if that's fair or not, but I'm throwing it out for you to consider. As it turned out, as they discovered, Cornstalk's force was definitely not just another small party keeping an eye on them. Which brings me back to the topic of numbers yet again. How many men were there? Well, by the morning of October 10th, Colonel Christian and his 300 men from Fincastle County had still not caught up. Based on Colonel Fleming's records, I personally believe Andrew Lewis had about 1,000 men, not all of which were fit for duty. This is, again, very different from the number you might see listed elsewhere. And trust me, I got one heck of a headache when I was sitting there going over all the sources trying to figure out what number I should go with, because it's just, I don't understand. But that's the one that seems to have the most substantial evidence for it. And likewise, we can't be completely certain how many men Cornstalk had. I lean towards believing what White Eyes said about 700 men with more following, simply because I think White Eyes had the least reason to exaggerate. Perhaps he didn't have all the facts either, but at least he's not wanting to exaggerate. During the battle, there are accounts that some of the American Indians were shouting claims of having 1,100 men with more coming. But that could have been just like a psychological tactic to kind of try to make the Virginians scared. That doesn't really prove their true numbers. Colonel Christian later wrote that he didn't think it was above 600. But again, Colonel Christian was not even present for the battle. So when you see all these different numbers thrown out, keep things like that in mind. The reason I keep bringing this up over and over again is because you will see that wildly different representation, and you'll see claims like, oh, Lewis's 1,400 men against Cornstalk's 600, for example. And, the Cornstalk's men were just massively outnumbered. I do think it's possible, even probable, that Cornstalk's men were outnumbered. I'm not trying to say that the numbers were completely even. It's just not as clear-cut as some might think, if you've read other, read books on this topic. And another thing to keep in mind that not everyone always mentions is that not all of Lewis's army even fought at any one point in that day. We start out with 300 Virginians being sent out, and Lewis, he does send reinforcements throughout the day, but according to what was written by the officers, there was never more than 400 Virginians engaged at any one point during the day. So I don't know what Cornstalk's approach was, if he kept some of his strength back as well, but that's what makes it kind of difficult here. What we do know, getting past the question of numbers, what we do know is that there were some really, really impressive men on that battlefield. Though, as I said, Cornstalk wasn't necessarily thrilled about going into battle. Once he, committed, once he was like, all right, this is what my men want, so this is what I'm going to do, he was all in. He didn't hold back because of his personal misgivings. Even the Virginians later wrote about his valor in the battle, how they heard Cornstalk shouting encouragement throughout the day to his men. It said that he killed one of his men who attempted to retreat in a cowardly manner. So, this is a man who's like, if we're going to fight, we're going to do this right, and we're going to put everything we have into it. And another thing about the American Indian tactics is they would hide their dead, beneath bushes or in the river to not expose the true extent of their losses, for the sake of morale and not giving the Virginians any encouragement. Now, going back to Charles Lewis and William Fleming, neither of them made it through the battle unscathed. And this is kind of why I wanted to tell y'all about them before we got to their injuries, because I do think it's important to know all these people as individuals, not just a number as part of the casualties of a battle. Charles, as known and respected as he was for his abilities, he was caught in the open talking to his men, and he gets shot. It's a mortal injury, but he just calmly makes his way back to camp. He encouraged the men he passed, saying, quote, "I am wounded, but go you on and be brave," end quote. Similarly, William Fleming was shot 3 times, twice in his left arm and once in the left side of his chest, to the point that he actually had part of his lungs coming out of the wound, apparently, and they had to just shove the lung back in his body. And I was reading the letters talking about his injuries, and I'm just sitting here oh my god. How ironic that the surgeon would be the one to get the injury like this. And I think if I remember it right, it was Fleming himself who just kind of shoved it back in there. And everyone seems to have expected that he was going to die as well, because that's pretty severe injury. But he also kept this cool, calm, and collected demeanor. And, he walks back to camp as well, and he's telling his men not to mind him, but to go up and fight. So the fighting goes all day long. It slows a little bit in the afternoon, but it's still going, it's still continuing. The battle didn't end until Cornstalk led an orderly retreat around sunset. And Colonel Andrew Lewis had sent messengers telling Colonel Christian, come on, get your butt up here, we need the help. And Christian and his Fincastle County men did not actually end up arriving until just about midnight. So they just entirely missed the battle. When everyone kind of had a chance to take stock of their losses, there were about 75 dead and 140 wounded among the Virginians. And I want you to put yourself in their shoes again for a moment and just imagine that you're walking along the battlefield, checking for survivors. Maybe this is after dusk, maybe this is the next morning, but you find an American Indian body that you recognize as your brother. And that's what happened for one of the Virginians by the name of Thomas Collett. And his brother, George Collett, had been taken captive as a child and adopted into a tribe. And then when, all of this comes up, George decided to fight under Cornstalk. And even though George died in the battle, he's not the only white captive who was adopted who chose to go fight with the American Indian family they had become a part of. We also know that a man named Tavenor Ross, as well as John Ward, these men were a similar situation where they'd been taken as children and they chose to side with their adopted families. And I find that really interesting. I certainly feel for Thomas, though, just, fighting this long battle, making it through the battle, and then making that sort of discovery on the battlefield after the fact. At that point, nobody was quite sure what kind of losses were sustained by Cornstalk and the Shawnee and their allies. As I mentioned, they were hiding their dead throughout the day, so it's really difficult to make an estimate. But I did find a newspaper article from February of 1775, which is a few months later, and it provides an answer for us. It reads, quote, "Some little time ago, the Shawnee Indians applied for leave to go to the late field of battle to bury their dead, most part of whom they had only time to hide, and were accompanied thither by Captain Russell of Fincastle, who learned from the Cornstalk, their principal headman, that he had lost upwards of 100 of his people in that engagement, 80 being killed on the spot, and a great number wounded, 20 of whom have since died in the towns." We don't have as much information about the identities of the American Indians who died on the battlefield. We know a couple, but it's really limited. The Battle of Point Pleasant had the highest casualties of Lord Dunmore's war, and maybe that explains part of why this is the battle that everyone knows about, if you actually know about Dunmore's war, I should say. It's the battle that gets remembered as being this war. And it did have its impact. Colonel Andrew Lewis and his men spent the next week caring for their wounded, fortifying their position at Point Pleasant. Andrew had lost a brother that he loved, and Colonel Fleming surprised them all by pulling through. Despite the chest wound and the 2 wounds in his arm, he survived it. On October 13th, 3 days after the battle, they had received orders from Governor Dunmore telling them to cross the Ohio River and march towards the lower Shawnee towns to meet up with Dunmore. Now, even though Andrew's son later wrote about how the men, they wanted revenge for their losses, and no doubt that is true, it doesn't seem like Andrew was in that much of a hurry, because they had their priorities, they had their wounded to take care of, and it wasn't until the 17th, a full week after the Battle of Point Pleasant, that he finally followed orders and crossed the Ohio, which I think is a good place to stop for the day. In the next video, I'll talk about the Camp Charlotte Agreement, as well as why that really isn't the last, the actual treaty that ended this war. As always, please like the video and comment your thoughts below. I've had a lot of people lately commenting, and I greatly appreciate that. If you haven't subscribed yet, please make sure that you do that as well. So thank you, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next video.